morning or afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Mark Mancini, and I'm the National Director of the Runnymede Society. I want to welcome you today to this really exciting and important event, I think, that we're putting on for the benefit of law students. And we're going to be discussing federal court and federal court of appeal clerkships today. And we have two very special guests who are very committed to Runnymede, who dedicated their time today to speak to you about this. So I'll do the job of introducing the speakers, and then we'll jump in to the event, and there will be time for Q&A at the close of it. So let me start by first introducing the two judges that will be giving their time to us today to talk to us about what's it like to clerk in the federal court system. And the first judge is Justice Ann Marie McDonald. She was the judge with whom I clerked when I clerked at the federal court, so I'm very thankful to Justice McDonald both for that experience and for her time here today. So Justice McDonald received a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1991 and a Bachelor of Laws in 1993 from the University of New Brunswick. At the time of her appointment to the federal court in September 2015, Madam Justice McDonald was the Deputy Managing Partner of the major Atlantic Canadian law firm McInnes Cooper. Her law practice focused primarily in the areas of commercial litigation, employment law, administrative law, and regulatory matters. She appeared before the courts in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Ontario, and at the Federal Court of Appeal, as well as before various administrative tribunals and regulatory bodies. So welcome, Justice McDonald, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mark.
Our second special guest is someone who some of you may be familiar with from his work in administrative law and in other areas. Our guest is Justice David Stratas from the Federal Court of Appeal. Graduated from Queen's University 1984, received his BCL from Oxford University in 1986, and he was born in Toronto. He was a law clerk to Justice Bertha Wilson of the Supreme Court of Canada. He was a litigation partner in various firms in Toronto before his appointment, an adjunct member of the Faculty of Law of Queen's University, where he won multiple faculty teaching awards, and of course he's also a very prolific scholar in his own right, authoring over 120 articles or conference papers on various legal topics. So Justice Stratas, thank you today for all of your time and your dedication to Runnymede, and for telling some of the students about the experience clerking for you.
Very happy to help. Thank you. Behind me, incidentally, is my law clerk, and I'm going to let him speak as well a little bit later. David Williams. There he is.
Welcome, David. So with those introductions aside, the way that this is going to go today, we're going to have Justice McDonald speak first for about 20 minutes. Then we'll turn things over to Justice Stratas and David. Justice Stratas will step away for a little bit, and David will speak candidly about his experience, and then Justice Stratas will add anything after the fact. Then we'll move to a Q&A. So we're going to try to move through briskly to save lots of time for questions. So Justice McDonald, I'll turn things over to you, and I'll just boot up your PowerPoint here, and we'll get started.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm looking forward to giving you an overview of clerking with the federal court, and I do have a PowerPoint that we will work through, which will provide just a sort of a overview of some of the topics I'm going to touch on. And Mark is sharing his screen.
See if I can start it. Okay, there we go. Does that look
Great.
good?
That looks good, and so I'll just get you to go to the next page. And this is just a bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll touch a bit on the jurisdiction of the federal court because it is unique. I'll talk about the makeup, the composition of the court, and then I'll talk about the law clerk program. And I'll talk about that generally, but I'll also add to that my own comments in terms of what I look for in a law clerk and how I integrate my law clerk into my day-to-day work. So unlike the superior courts in the provinces, the federal court gets its jurisdiction in a different way. It's not inherent general, but it is jurisdiction that is assigned or existing and has been conferred. And as it currently stands, I think somebody's added this up and continues to do so, but there are at least 100 different statutes that confer jurisdiction on the federal court. So needless to say, the jurisdiction is broad and it's varied. And some of the broad categories include things such as national security, claims involving the federal crown, First Nations, intellectual property matters, admiralty disputes, and class proceedings. And the court, in terms of the administrative law jurisdiction, sits in review of decisions from a number of boards, commissions, and tribunals. And some of this will be familiar if you follow any of the work of the federal courts, but certainly immigration and refugee matters, election matters, official languages, access to information, privacy matters. Prisoners in federal institutions can make applications to the federal court for relief. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, of course, is an area where the federal court spends time. And environmental impact assessments, national defense, public service employment matters, aeronautical and transportation, and oceans and fisheries. So a very broad jurisdiction. The court works in a vast field. And I can tell you that one of the things that clerks continue to express is how surprised they are at the number of matters that fall within the jurisdiction of the federal court. They say that both in awe and also sometimes expressing concern about having to work in so many different areas. But one of the things, and I'll touch on this a bit more, one of the things you certainly become very adept at doing when you're clerking in the federal court is shifting gears and getting learned up very quickly on a different area of law. So in terms of the composition of the court itself, we have Chief Justice Crampton and Associate Chief Justice Gagné, 32 full-time judges, 8 supernumerary judges, and 8 prothonotary. And they come from all across the country. So there is significant diversity in terms of regional representation on the court. The court, which is based in Ottawa, is itinerant, so it sits across the country. And in terms of the relationship with a law clerk, we do currently have a 1 law clerk per judge teaming arrangement. So it's a one-on-one teaming, and I'll touch a bit more on that. For supernumerary judges, they tend to, you might have 2 judges who share 1 law clerk. And then the prothonotary also work with the law clerks in a rotational program that's set up so that they also have access to the important work that law clerks do. In terms of the law clerk program itself, you'll see for the current 2020-2021 clerkship cycle, there were 58 law clerks hired. So 17 for the Federal Court of Appeal, 40 in the Federal Court, and 1 for the Court Martial Appeal Court. So that's significant numbers, and I'm hoping by the interest shown in this presentation that it will encourage you all to consider applying. The work of a law clerk has the features that I would suggest you would expect and what we expect, which is there's going to be research on specific legal issues and beyond. There's going to be preparing bench memos, editing draft judgments, and proofreading draft judgments is an important part of the work, and then assisting judges in some of the other things that judges do, such as speaking like this. All of that to say that there are qualities, some key qualities that law clerks should have. It perhaps goes without saying that law clerks should have excellent legal research and analytical skills. They should be thorough, exercise good judgment, have good writing skills. I would say excellent writing skills, but good is what the PowerPoint says. Initiative, I think, is an important factor, being detail-oriented, reliable, and of course, bilingualism is an asset for those judges who sit in both official languages. I'm going to add to this list my own list of what I look for in a clerk. And I'll preface this by saying, obviously, as judges, we all have different things that we look for. But I'll start by saying one of the things I do is I consider the applications from all of the law schools across Canada. In other words, and I know I'm speaking for many of my colleagues on the bench, do not confine my search for a law clerk to certain law schools. I consider applications from across Canada.
Oh, Lily, I'm so sorry. I forgot I have another Zoom.
Hello? Okay, I will keep going. And again, these are my personal views on what a law clerk should be able to, the skill set they should have in thinking about and coming to the job. Enthusiasm is an important part of it as far as I'm concerned, and you need to enjoy challenges because the job is challenging, the work is challenging. It is hard work, but it's very interesting. It is not a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 job. There will be some evenings and some weekends. And I'm not saying that's the norm, but it certainly can happen. If it's a week, for example, when the judge you're working with is on duty, they may be doing hearings late into the evening. Judges usually like their clerks to be part of that. So there is that possibility. And if your judge is getting ready for a trial, chances are you'll be spending the weekend before the trial starts doing some pre-trial work with the judge. So I think those are things to bear in mind, but in my view, that mimics much of the real world in terms of professional working environment where the demands may fall outside of the regular hours. I think a clerk needs to come to the job with a very open mind and approach their tasks with rigor, being organized and being able to set your own priorities, and the ability to work independently, I think, is a very important component of the job. You will have to manage multiple projects and multiple work products that may have competing deadlines. And that's not to say as the clerk, it's your job to set the deadlines, but you do have to manage your time either on a daily or weekly basis to reasonably meet some of the deadlines. And to do that, it helps if you're proactive and responsive. And I think one of the things that's important, and even as a judge, we have to adapt to this. You have to have the ability to go from working in a fast-paced environment where there may be a week where you have multiple hearings to then moving into a mode where you have to be methodical and reflective. So being able to kind of move between those modes is another important feature of a law clerk. I feel personally very strongly about having a respectful and an inclusive workplace, and I impose that same requirement on everyone I work with, my clerk included. And when I say respectful, I just don't mean as between my clerk and myself. I mean between me and my clerk and everyone else we interact with in the context of this job that we're all doing. So that is something that I feel very strongly about. And I think law clerks need to be humble. And it's good not to take yourself too seriously. And a sense of humor will take you a long way. So as back to the slides, in terms of the experience, it is primarily a one-on-one relationship. And there's some noise bleeding through.
Could everyone just make sure to mute their mics, please? Thank you.
Okay. So it is primarily a one-on-one relationship with the judge. And by background, most judges who are appointed to the bench have 20 to 30 years of experience in the legal profession, and they come from a variety of backgrounds. Some of us come from the private practice of law. Some come from the practice of law within government, within industry, and some come from academia. So there really is a real wealth of knowledge from various backgrounds within the court. And that's a real opportunity for clerks to be able to tap into that. And relatedly, there is the opportunity to work with other judges. So despite the fact that you are paired one-on-one with a judge, I certainly encourage my clerks to seek out and work with other judges when the opportunity is available. There may be an area of law that you're particularly interested in, and looking at your judge's schedule, you think you may not get the opportunity to be exposed to that area. So there is always the opportunity to work with another judge who may have a hearing coming up in that area. That's something I encourage my clerk to do. I think it provides a well-rounded experience. Clerking does fulfill articling requirements in Quebec and Ontario. For the other jurisdictions, I think it varies, and obviously you would need to check with your provincial law society to get that information. And let me just add a few of my own comments here about how I work with my clerk. It is a very interactive team approach. The core team is myself, my law clerk, and my judicial assistant. And I can tell you my law clerks learn very quickly how important having a strong working relationship with the judicial assistants in the federal court are and is. They are a wealth of knowledge. They know how the place operates, and they know how to get things done. So that core team is very important. It's very important to me in getting my job done, which is trying to get decisions issued in as timely a manner as possible and in a thorough and complete manner as possible. My responsibility to my clerk is to provide mentoring, feedback, and guidance, and to set priorities. We have regular check-ins, my clerk and I, and the check-ins often take the form of a debrief session after a hearing, and that allows, and I often ask my clerk, what did you think of that? What did you think of this approach? What did you think of that lawyer's style? Did you think that was effective advocacy? Was it ineffective? How did they deal with the evidence? What about, did they address cases that didn't support their position, and did they do an effective job of differentiating their facts? All of those discussions are very valuable in the clerking experience because it allows you to express your views, but also to hear the views from me and I'm just one person, but my views on what I considered to have been good, bad, persuasive, not persuasive. So I think that debriefing session after a hearing is very important. And as well, as indicated, I do ask my clerk to seek out opportunities to work with other judges. I think that makes an opportunity. And I can tell you that the law clerks as a group are very collegial. They do work in an environment that is very collegial, and they are a very supportive group with each other, which is very nice to see. And I can say with a fair degree of confidence that despite the challenges that we're in right now with the pandemic and most clerks working remotely, they have, I'm going to say, worked harder to make sure that they stay as collegial a group as ever. And that is something that's very refreshing to see. So I do think from a workplace perspective, it does provide that level of collegiality and comfort. The application deadline for this year, or for the 2022-2023 clerkship year, is January 11, 2021. The online application portal will be available as of November 27th. The applications are submitted online, and they are one application for any of the federal court of appeal, and the court martial appeal court. Interviews start in February and end around March or April. Interviews will likely, I think with a fair degree of certainty, we can say that interviews will happen virtually this year, although that has to a certain degree been the case in the past anyway. So regardless of where in the country you may be interested in applying from, rest assured that we can conduct the interview by video conferencing just as effectively as we can in person. And I tend to involve my law clerk in the interviewing process as well, because I think the ability to actually ask questions to somebody who's fulfilling the role is very useful, because they will have answers to questions that I may not be able to provide. So I do encourage you to look at the website. There is information there about applying. And if you have any questions, please contact Chantal Prue for more information. But let me close with this. I do encourage you to apply to the federal court if you have an interest in clerking with the federal court. It is a very exciting and a unique opportunity that will equip you with a very strong skill set that will serve you quite well in whatever career you choose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Justice McDonald. And again, for everyone who may have questions, we will take some questions up at the end of the presentations from the judges. So now I'll turn things over to Justice Stratas and David, and we'll go from there. Thank you again for your time.
Real pleasure, and thank you for having me today, and welcome everyone to this conference. Everything that Justice McDonald said, and said so well, applies to this court. It's the same program. When you apply online, you simply tick a box and you're applying not just to the federal court, but to the Federal Court of Appeal. Let me tell you as well that even though the Federal Court of Appeal is the appellate court, the experience of clerking is remarkably similar, regardless of what court you're in. I don't want you to have the impression that the experience is better somehow in the higher court. That's just not right. Both courts have independent operation, and from your standpoint, in terms of learning about what judges do and how the judicial process works, the experiences are very, very similar. What I propose to do is say just a few brief supplementary words, and then I would like to turn it over to my current law clerk, David Williams, and there's David there. We'll switch chairs. As a matter of fact, I'm going to leave the room. I'm going to leave the room because I want you to hear direct from the horse's mouth, uninfluenced by my presence at all. I don't think he'd be influenced at all. David's a very frank, candid person, but so much the better. He'll bring me back in when it's question and answer time. I was in your position, and I ended up being a clerk. I applied to be a clerk, and I was at the Supreme Court of Canada. I clerked for Justice Bertha Wilson. The experience being a clerk there as opposed to here, I think, is similar. It's just that we do more cases, and it tends to be more doctrinal. We do a lot more following and discovering the case law. Supreme Court, as you know, at the top of the apex, especially for certain judges up there, it tends to be a little bit more, shall I say, free-ranging. If you're interested in practicing law later as a lawyer, I would suggest to you that actually the federal court system would be a better system to clerk in. It will resonate much more with your experience in practice. Clerking for me was transformative. I entered as a certain type of individual, and I left as a much better individual. I really encourage you to apply. In both courts, I think the biggest feature, if you were to ask me what's the best thing about clerking in the federal court system, it's the one-on-one relationship with a judge. And particularly if you get along really well with your judge, you will have a friend and mentor for the rest of your life. And very few people these days can say they have mentors. Clerking, if it works out well, and in my experience usually does, you leave with a friend and mentor for the rest of your life, and that's invaluable. What do I look when hiring a clerk? And my answer, I think, is no different from my colleagues. Judges, by nature, cannot consult widely. We don't phone a friend. We don't have lifelines like that. We have to figure out things on our own. And in terms of who we can speak with other colleagues, but they're busy too. So the single law clerk that each of us has at our disposal is basically the only assistance we have. Huge amount of dependence on our part on the law clerk, which means huge amount of responsibility for the law clerk, but at the same time, lots of training and tutelage and mentoring for the law clerk. So it's kind of a win-win situation all around. I look for someone who obviously is up to snuff, academically speaking, good work ethic. Frankly, most who apply have that. The other thing I'm really looking for is personal fit. The way I use law clerks and the way some of my colleagues use law clerks is, David can verify this, but I'm seeing a law clerk sometimes for an hour or more of direct face-to-face every day. So it has to be someone that I will like. It has to be someone that I will find engaging. It has to be someone that will stimulate and provoke me. I'm not like most judges. We're not looking for cheerleaders. We're also not looking for people that will just fawn and say, oh, you're so great. I mean, we're not looking for that. We're actually looking for a good, honest, friendly critic. We're looking for someone, frankly, I tell clerks this, I told David this when I started, it's like I'm running a little law firm and I'm the senior partner only by virtue of age and training and experience. I'm hiring a junior partner, not an associate, not an articling student. And so I'm looking for someone that will work in partnership with me and advance not my work, but the work of the whole chambers and the court as a whole. So am I looking for sycophants? No. Am I looking for savage critics? No. But I'm looking for something kind of in the middle. I'm looking for a junior partner. You'll have a chance to ask me questions later, but you know what? I'm going to leave it to David Williams, my law clerk right now. I'm going to leave the room. David, why don't you join me here? Back soon.
Okay, he's gone, so I can say all the terrible things about him. Only joking. I hope there was some applause, but it's tough to feel out your jokes over Zoom, obviously. I just want to say, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's really nice to speak to you. And I, by way of background, I articled at a major law firm in Toronto last year, and I graduated from law school the year before. So I was in your shoes not very long ago. I remember attending a similar presentation at Queen's University with Justice Stratas, and he said that clerking was the equivalent of 20 years of practical advocacy experience, which was a bold claim, I thought, but a very interesting one. And I did my research, and I found out that he was probably true. And you know, it's been true so far in my time here. It's been a really fantastic experience. And in terms of training, it's really second to none. With respect to opportunities at this stage of all of your legal careers. With respect to what the job is like, it's really fun. It doesn't have the same pressures of private practice in respect to competition amongst people at your same seniority level, which is nice. So it's really collaborative, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know all the other clerks. At the Federal Court of Appeal, and it's the same at the Federal Court, people come from all over the country, and a lot of people don't have a ton of ties to Ottawa. So everyone is like their friend group is at the court, and it's nice to get to know different people. And for what I've experienced so far, and from what I've heard from people that have done before, you form a lot of lifelong friendships with really smart, interesting people as well. So that's one aspect of the job that maybe isn't in the brochure, so to speak, but is really, really useful. And working with Justice Stratas is really fun as well. He mentioned before, we do have a lot of face-to-face conversations, which is really enjoyable. He's a very nice man and very smart as well, and learning a lot from him. I think I touched on the training a bit before. My background is I want to go back into private practice, so this has been immensely useful for me. And even if you don't want to do that, a lot of my colleagues want to go into more government or policy roles or maybe pursue academia. Really useful for all those things as well. The courts are, if you're interested in law in the sense of litigation rather than transactional practices, the courts are where the rubber hits the road. And to have the time here and see it and interact with, as Justice McDonald mentioned, multiple judges, you get really an awesome look into how the law works and the considerations that judges will take into account when deciding cases. And it's a very, very good practical experience, regardless of what you want to do with your career. I think Justice McDonald and Justice Stratas mentioned this a little bit before, but I will say that different chambers work differently. And the beauty of the federal court system is the one-on-one relationship between judges and clerks. But it does pay to do a bit of research while you're applying. After you put in your application, of course, into the different chambers and judges, how they run their chambers, what type of people they're like, because you want to make sure that relationship is simpatico. The judges, in my experience, are all very kind and welcoming people, and they'll get along with a broad range of people. But maybe you have a different idea about what type of work you want to be doing or whatnot. It's probably best to know that in advance. And then in terms of different chambers as well, whether or not the judge is supernumerary or more senior or less senior in the court might affect the number of cases they're seeing and what type of cases. Again, my experience here is very minimal, so I don't, I'm by no means providing a gospel on that, but I think it's just as a practical tip to you who might be interested in applying. I think that's something to consider as well as the working relationship and what type of work they'll be doing. I realized I didn't quite do a daily look at my day in the life of a clerk, so to speak. But Justice McDonald touched on it briefly. A lot of the work will fall into a few categories that include editing reasons, preparing for hearings, as well as preparing for extrajudicial speeches, presentations, and papers. The Federal Court of Appeal will sit in kind of weeks at a time for hearings. So Justice Stratas will know several weeks in advance that he has a hearing week, and he'll know the cases and have the materials. And there's lots of preparatory work that goes into getting ready for those hearings. So reading all the materials and the records. And in his chambers, I play, I think, a good role in helping with that. And that involves going through all the materials, forming a view on the case. A lot of judges will ask for a bench memorandum. So a memo setting out the key issues and facts in the case, as well as a suggested disposition. Justice Stratas tends to just want to have a face-to-face conversation where we'll go through the case and discuss it. And that's really, really useful. And then after a hearing, if there's a decision held in reserve, there's a lot of work that goes into drafting those reasons and furthering it. And the law clerk will play a role throughout, maybe more editing, maybe researching discrete points of law, maybe drafting writing paragraphs and doing a first draft on certain sections. That varies, and it varies with the case as well. But that's briefly the work that's done. I'm happy to answer questions more on that in the future. I will say I might get some questions about this, but I'll preempt it because lots of people want to know what the process is like and any tips for going through the process. I would say, based on my experience, an important part of your application is your references. And it's not a bad idea if you're in first or second year law school to have an idea as to which professors you might want as your academic references, and to cultivate relationship. They'll be able to provide a much better reference if they know you, you've perhaps done some work, done some research assistance with them. And in my experience, law professors are more than happy to help with that and to get to know their students better. I think my experience, at least in law school, I wasn't comfortable really doing that until third year, which I regret. I think that was a big mistake because they were very welcoming and very helpful, very keen to help you move to the next stage. And even if just walking up to a professor after class and asking if there's any research you can help with, you'd be surprised how often there are things that you can help with. I would encourage you to do that. I'd say, and this applies outside of just the federal court system, I assume most of you, like I did, will be applying broadly, although I think the federal court system is the best. Do your homework on the different courts. I know some courts operate with a pool of clerks, so you're not with a certain judge, and some you rotate judges throughout the year. That's going to make it a slightly different experience. So maybe have that in mind, and then you'll know what might be good for you. I'm mindful of my time here, but I'm almost done. One consideration, should you do it instead of articling or afterwards? I did it after. I didn't apply to do it instead of articling, largely because I didn't think my grades were good enough. But I think after talking with my colleagues, it doesn't hurt to put your name in the hat, so to speak, at first instance, like as soon as you can. And then if you're not successful that year, you reapply the next year. And a lot of people are successful that way. So that being said, I think I'm a much better clerk and I'm getting more out of the experience having spent a year articling and working in private practice. In terms of kind of what type of candidate you should be, I think you should be genuine. There's no, Justice Stratas said, which is true, that it has to be someone he gets along with. But that's not a narrow category by any means. It's quite broad. Anyone who's genuine and enthusiastic and willing to learn will have a place. I think as well, and Justice Stratas mentioned this as well, a focus on doctrine, on legal doctrine and legal reasoning is very important at least in his chambers, and I think at this court more broadly. The Supreme Court might favor candidates with more of a policy focus. And I remember in first year, kind of what's the difference between policy and doctrine. It gets a little jumbled. So here's my tip is that the law papers you might read that say, the law is this, which will have this result, and this is bad because, are more policy focused, whereas papers that look into a way of deciding cases with heavy reference to case law and how it's developed, with more of a focus on the reasoning towards a certain outcome, or more doctrinal focus. I don't know if that's helpful. And I know the Runnymede Society has its own views as to whether or not courts should be deciding on the basis of policy or doctrine. And I won't get into that here, but I know a lot of judges, the doctrine is most important. That's the law that binds them. And it's very, very important that candidates have a view towards that. And I agree with that entirely. So with that being said, I think I'll bring Justice Stratas back in the room for questions. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I really enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. That's interesting perspective from a clerk that's doing the job right now. So that's a good thing to hear. So we'll see if Justice Stratas has any other final thoughts before we turn to questions. So if you have questions, your options are to just say it out loud over video, preferably by raising your hand using the raise hand function first, or you can ask the question via the chat box. So I see I've gotten one question already, so we can do that. So Justice Stratas, is there any kind of things you want to say to wrap up, or do you want to move into?
No, not at all. I thank you, David, for doing that. And I think the most important thing is the questions of the participants. So why don't they fire away?
Okay. So does anyone have any questions to start off with here? Okay, we have one. Julia, you can go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you guys for hosting this and for participating. It's been Great to hear about this so far. My kind of question is, whenever you're considering an applicant at these courts in particular, is it more focused on kind of grades and academia, or is it a more holistic resume research? Like, kind of what's the approach when you look at an applicant? What's the priority in terms of strengths?
Well, I'll tackle that first and then just let Justice Stratas go. I look at the whole package, to be honest. Obviously, marks matter, but they are not the be-all and end-all for me. I think well-rounded people who have a good grounding in academics, but also who have other life experiences make the best clerks. I think they have the best experience. So if you've got very, very high academic marks, but all you've done is studied, versus somebody who has good marks, but they've worked full-time the whole way through law school, that tells me something. So marks are not the be-all and end-all.
Definitely the same for me. I have hired medalists, academic medalists from law school, but often I have not. I'm looking at the whole package. I'm looking for someone who, frankly, I want to see for an hour or two or more every day for the year. And so obviously there's some people that I know it just won't fit. There's others that I know it will. I would say, frankly, I have always hired from the top third of the law school class, no lower than that. If you're in the top third, for me, and I think it's true for many of my colleagues, you would be eligible.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to the chat now. We've got a few questions. In the chat. So one of them is, do you give equal consideration to applicants who have first degrees in law from other common law jurisdictions? Are these applicants at a disadvantage as opposed to a Canadian JD degree? And does holding a Canadian common law LLM assist to make up any gaps? I don't know.
I can handle that. I think it depends on the judge. I think it's good if you have Canadianized your degree in some way. What some might do, for example, if they're coming from a foreign law school, some might wish to article first and then come after articling. That's a frequent route. That's one that David Williams took. And I can give you a tangible example that foreign law school applicants do stand a good chance. My colleague, Justice Laskin on the Federal Court of Appeal, has hired a law clerk for next year who will serve next year. And that law clerk is from a U.S. law school. So at a disadvantage, for some judges you could be, but you're certainly not precluded.
Okay. Justice Donald, do you have anything to add to that, or is that?
No, I don't have anything to add. I do think, if you've only had, if you don't have some Canadian law background, it would be, the uphill battle would be that much steeper to get your feet under you, but it's not insurmountable.
Okay, we'll go back to the video question. So I see Zephy. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Really sorry. But if you want to go ahead and ask your question, yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks so much, Mark. It's Zephy. And thank you, judges, for being here. It's making me very excited about the prospect of clerking with you. So my question is mainly about academic writing and papers. I have some colleagues who have published papers, whereas myself, I've written some papers that are not yet published or weren't published at the time, or I maybe should have published them. How would you like that material translated to you? Because I've heard that discussing those topics can be a valuable part of any interview discussion. Or do you think that it's better to talk about other things? Would I list those topics in my cover letter, my resume, or do you have any preferences?
Well, I'll start answering that. There is the opportunity to provide writing samples, and that's an important feature for a lot of us who are considering law clerks, mainly because you're going to spend an awful lot of time writing. And writing style matters. My personal approach to writing is I try to keep it at a more basic level. I'm not writing my decisions for other judges or for lawyers. I'm trying to write it for the parties, and that is in some ways a much harder way to write. It's easier to write in very long, verbose, flowery language than to be succinct and concise and to the point. So I want someone who shares that writing style.
The writing sample requirement, if you've written something, by all means submit it. But might I suggest to you that it might be good to submit something that isn't really, I'm going to use this pejoratively, I don't mean it this way, but really kind of academic and hard to understand and deep and theoretical. The writing that we appreciate on the job is actually going to be clear, direct, brief, and practical. I have a suggestion for you, which is if you don't have that, rather than sending in your thesis or term paper, consider taking a recent decision of the court you're applying to, or the Supreme Court, for example, and write a 3 or 4 page case comment, taking care to make it clear, direct, and brief. The writing sample is kind of used as a rehearsal for how you will write to us. And I think many judges would want to see clear, direct, and brief, rather than something that we have to really think about and pore over and so on. I think your academic chops and your intellectual firepower will be demonstrated by, in some respects, your resume, but also your transcript. I think the writing sample is used for showing off what the year will be like when you start to write for us.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go back to the questions. This one should be quick. Is security clearance a requirement for the job? And if yes, what level? I don't know if Chantal might be a better person to answer those kind of questions, but if one of you know, let's.
Well, I do know for the national security work, it certainly is required.
Yeah.
So yes, for some positions, if you're going to be working in that area, you would have to have the security clearance.
And you can ask for that clearance if you, in your cover letter, indicate an interest in national security work. Express an interest there that if hired, you would be willing to submit to the process to obtain that clearance. That might be, depending on the judge who's interested in you, that might be a plus. What I did when David was hired, did we mention in the interview national security? We did. I knew that some national security stuff was coming and that I might be on the panel during David's year at the court. So I actually mentioned to him in the interview and asked him if he'd be willing to submit to that process. He did go through it. David, orally, quickly, it was fast and easy, right?
Yeah, a series of interviews and forms. It was relatively easy.
I mean, the questions are a little intrusive, but that's the cost of getting the clearance. And as a result, we've already had a couple of motions in a secured facility looking at secret things, and that was fun. Yeah.
Okay, so that's good information. We'll go back to the video questions. So let me just check. I think Danielle was next. So Danielle, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. The question I have is with regards to what percentage of justices in all 3 courts work in both official languages?
Great question. I should know that in my court. We got, 16 judges? I think there's 6, I'm going to guess 6 unilingual people, or, oh, just a minute. There might be 8 who aren't bilingual enough to sit in a French language case. So there's a fair number of us that, such as myself, we do not sit in a French language case. I might do the odd French language motion that's simple or on consent, because my comprehension is good enough for that. What on my court, many of the Anglophones like me do, is we stay away from bilingual candidates. That isn't uniform, but we tend to leave bilingual candidates for the judges that need it.
Yeah, and I would say it's the same on the federal court, and sadly, I don't know the actual number to answer your question either. But I do certainly know there are a lot of judges who actively seek out bilingual candidates, in even judges who aren't necessarily sitting in French cases. If they're working on their French, the opportunity to have a clerk who is bilingual is often considered quite indispensable.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, another chat question here. What does the selection process look like after the preliminary applications or cover letters and resumes are submitted? And what does the interview process look like? And then are there any written tests?
I've got a couple of answers. It very much depends on the individual judge. I suspect most interviews this year will be done by Zoom. In some years, I don't think I did this last year, but in some years, I leave people with fake reasons from the federal court, and I leave them alone for a half hour, get them to then look at the fake reasons of the federal court and dialogue with me about what they see in the reasons. And I use that as kind of a rehearsal for some of the chambers discussions we would have if you were hired. But not all judges do that. The interview unfolds very much according to the individual judge. Some judges are very brief and just want to get you briefly, get to know you as a person, and the interview might only be no more than a half hour. My interviews, David, yours was an hour and a half or so. I mean, hour and a half for me is kind of typical. And that's because I really want to get to know the candidate as a person. Because as I said, I'll be spending so much time with the candidate over the course of a year. I want to just see how we're going to mesh, how it's going to work.
And I think that's a similar approach with the federal court judges. It is very individually driven. I always include my current clerk in the interview process because I think they can offer input and insights into what the job actually entails better than I can. And they can also talk about, you know, what the one-on-one relationship is like, because I think it very much differs. Some judges want you to be able to come and discuss important cases. That's not my personal style. I likewise am trying to assess a bit of a fit, because it is a very one-on-one relationship, and it's somebody who I have to be able to work with, but somebody who can also take constructive criticism and who's quite prepared to push back and say to me, no, I think you've got that all wrong. Let's, rethink this. So it is somebody who you have to be able to have that open dialogue with, open and frank dialogue.
If I could just add a couple of things, Justice McDonald, I couldn't agree more. I hate sycophants. Many of my colleagues hate sycophants. We're looking for a friendly critic. When I draft my reasons, I give them to David, and David this year has come back to me, including some reasons that some of you may have read this year. David will see them and draft them. Sometimes he comes back and he says, he says, Justice Stratas, I don't think paragraphs 12 to 18 work that well. I think they're misconceived. And what he does is he'll not just point out the problem, but give me a solution. He'll offer ideas about how I should do it. And I'll be frank, a lot of you might read my stuff and think, oh, isn't that a nice piece by Stratas? Well, let me tell you, when I have a good clerk, and David's a really good clerk, you get a synergy. So it becomes 1 + 1 = 3. And my reasons end up being a hell of a lot better than I could have reached on my own. So a good clerk works so seamlessly and well with me that the end product ends up being greater than either of us could have done alone.
Great. We'll go to the video questions. So I see Amit's hand raised, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Justices, for doing this, and thank you as well, David. I'm curious if you have any suggestions on how we can, in our written materials, signal interest in the federal court system, which I take it is an important part of wanting to clerk at these courts. And the reason for my question is, it's my sense that, at least at my law school at the University of Toronto, that our course offerings in the federal court jurisdiction are a little bit weaker than, say, a provincial appeal court. And I take it that's just a kind of symptom of the particular faculty we have. So I'm curious if you have any suggestions on how we can signal that in our written materials or our cover letters.
Just McDonald, I could go first if you want.
Go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. I must say, and I think many of my judges would agree, you don't have to signal a huge interest in our jurisdiction. I'm looking for talent and personality. And matter of fact, many of the people I hire have never done patents and trademarks. Some of them haven't even done patents and trademarks in law school. Some have an interest in administrative law. I think that's important because we do so much of it. Some have not done taxation. They might have done a basic course in tax or maybe not. That's not disqualifying. And I'm not interested in hiring a federal court sycophant. I'm looking for raw talent and facility and personality, nothing more.
And I'll just add, the mere fact that you're applying signifies that you're interested in the jurisdiction. So I think beyond that, there's nothing else you need do.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll go to the chat. Okay, from Alex, are all the interviews one-on-one? So would that mean an applicant may end up doing multiple interviews with a number of different justices?
That would be right.
Yes.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
Some people pick up 4 or 5 interviews. What some of us do, I'm early off the mark, and within like the first couple days after the applications are available to us, I start sending out offers to interview. And the fact that I guess a number of people will indicate an interest in you. So you might interview, if you're lucky, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. What I happen to do, because I'm early off the mark, is I write interview notes to my colleagues. And so that often prompts others to interview. I'm sorry, I cut you off, Mark.
And a similar process plays out with the federal court as well. I think, there's a pre-selection criteria that we all individually sort of look to. But yes, the reality is oftentimes applicants will go through multiple interviews with different judges.
Okay, so the question goes on, which justice gets the first pick? And finally, can an applicant demonstrate a preference for a particular justice? So I
wouldn't express an interest in a particular justice. I think you got to be available to as many people as possible. I'm not sure I would want to hire a clerk that expressed preference for me, because my colleagues might be annoyed that I've hired an apparent fan. So probably not a good idea. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, which justice gets first pick?
Oh, we do it by order of seniority. And it's done if you've ever participated in a fantasy sports league or a hockey pool. What happens is we have a draft, and the first pick goes to the Chief Justice, and then it goes to the justices in order of seniority. But what tends to happen is we're a close group. We tend to talk to each other, and we tend to stay out of each other's way, so we don't get too many conflicts. We kind of work it out in advance.
And a similar process plays out with the federal court. It is ultimately based on seniority. But what you tend to see as the interview process is going on is judges will start to circulate their comments about candidates they've interviewed who they think other judges, for whatever reason, might be interested in. So it does become a bit of a collaborative process. And a lot of judges will have interviewed 4 candidates who they think are very good. And so we'll let others know that, geez, if you're still looking, any one of these candidates would be, a great candidate. So there's a fair bit of, collegiality in the background that happens as part of the interview process.
Hey, Mark, can I just add one other comment that occurred to me that's, I think, pretty important? Most applicants are very strong law students, and most applicants have worked very hard on their studies. I must say that I'm always attracted by people that show something else other than being great in law school. And so I like hiring people, and there's no one type. For me, it rotates from year to year, but I like people that bring something different to the table. So it might be someone who left school for a while and was working in the real world for a while, or it might be someone who has very strong financial and accounting expertise, or it might be someone who took a year off and traveled, or maybe did foreign volunteer work, or it might be someone who has a particular hobby that's fascinating. Maybe, last year my clerk was a very accomplished musician. And I am not a music person, but that's a different frame of reference for me. And I thought it would be very interesting to spend a year with that person. And it was a spectacular year. So I didn't say that earlier, but if you've got something different about your background, don't think it has to be suppressed. I would play it out.
That's I think, very important information for students to hear. Things outside of law can be useful in law, so I think it's a really useful piece of advice. So I see that we have 2 questions left, one on video, one on chat. Can we finish up maybe with those 2 questions? So let's do that. So let's go, Ryan, I see your hand is raised, and then we'll go to the final chat question.
Yeah, I want to start by echoing thanks to all those involved in this event. It's been very helpful. My question relates to along the lines of preference, but given that it is a common application, if you're planning on applying to multiple courts, is it wise, or do you recommend signaling in a cover letter a preference for one of the courts over the other, even if you'd be honored to clerk at either court?
I would not express a preference. I think the clerk experience in either court is so strong. You want any old port in a storm, believe me. And I think, if you apply to both, but you express a preference for the Federal Court of Appeal, I don't think many federal court judges would be too keen to find you, and similarly, vice versa. I note in the background, incidentally, a Pittsburgh Penguins hockey sweater. And I'm a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, and I'm not sure about that. I'm just joking, actually. I have hired people from rival hockey teams, and it creates a lot of fun and interest throughout the year. But David, just as an example, who do you cheer for?
Go Leafs.
Go Leafs!
Wow.
Born and raised in Toronto, but I'm losing faith. There'll always be loyalty there, because
Don't
that's
lose
where I'm
faith.
born and raised.
Don't lose faith, and I'll see you at the parade next year. We'll bump into each other 4:30 in the morning on Yonge Street. We'll see you at the parade.
I'm sure Ryan's looking forward to that. Okay. Okay, so we just two more quick questions on the chat here. So one last one. Can you say a bit about the onboarding process after you've been hired as a clerk? What kind of initial training, if any, does a clerk receive? So roughly similar, I think, between the courts.
Yeah, I think it is. I'll just start, and Justice Stratas should add because he's part of it. But it is a very extensive onboarding clerk orientation program. I spent a lot of time in law firms, and we got nowhere near the type of onboarding program in law firms that the federal courts have. So it's as an extensive program to get people up and running that I've seen.
I'm going to let David speak to that. David, why don't you talk about the training you went through?
Yeah, very quickly, I'll echo that. Over the first week and a half is training every day, and then they're spread out throughout that. But you get training on all the key areas of jurisdiction, and lots of the training is with the federal court clerks at the same time. It was over Zoom this year, obviously because of the pandemic, but I take it would be in classrooms otherwise. And you get that from the judges directly. So Justice Stratas taught us administrative law and practice and procedure at the Federal Court of Appeal, and I mean, you can't learn from anyone better than that. And likewise, tax experts were teaching tax, intellectual property experts teaching intellectual property. So it's really, the training's quite remarkably thorough and condensed, but very thorough and very, very good for getting up to speed. And I refer to the reference materials all the time throughout my work here.
Great. Yeah, that's good information and consistent with my experience when I was at the federal court as well. Really felt like the training prepared me for the job, and speaking to my colleagues, same sort of thing. So final question here. It's a twist on a question that was previously asked. So would you consider foreign graduates that come from a civil law jurisdiction and did their LLM in Canada?
Well, I'll start with that because I happened to, when I practiced law, worked with a lawyer who was exactly that. She did her law degree in India and then did her LLM at Dalhousie, and she was the brightest lawyer I worked with. So it's certainly not something I would hesitate to have as a clerk.
I know 2 years ago, one of my Quebec colleagues hired exactly that type of law clerk, the exact same background and profile. Definitely doable.
Great. Okay, well, that's actually, we're right on time, actually, 1 hour and 10 minutes. So that's, in today's day and age, that's an accomplishment. So I want to, first of all, just give some thank yous. I want to thank both of our guests, Justice David Stratas, Justice Ann Marie McDonald, for their time today dedicating to educating students about this important experience. Thank you really very much to both of you for that. I want to thank all of the students that attended this event and took time out to come and learn more about federal court clerkships. I hope you found the experience helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the Runnymede Society website, and I'll be able to, if you have any questions after the event, I can certainly direct you to the right places to find answers. And so with that, I will end the session. And again, thank you all of you, and thank you to our guests for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.